Hello, welcome back to This Week in History. I am Bradley Smith, and today we're going to be covering 2 weeks worth of topics. Today we're going to be covering from March 23rd through April 5th. Let's get into it, not waste any time. Alright, starting things off on March 23rd, 1775, during the Second Virginia Convention in Richmond, Patrick Henry delivered one of the most famous speeches in American history. He argued for the mobilization of Virginia militia against the British, famously concluding with the ultimatum, "I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." Now, we move on to March 24th. On March 24th, 1603, after a reign of 44 years, Queen Elizabeth I died at Richmond Palace at the age of 69. Her death marked the end of the Tudor dynasty. Since she had no children, the throne was passed to her cousin, King James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, successfully uniting the crowns of England and Scotland. Now we move on to March 25th. On March 25th, 1965, after 3 attempts and days of walking, Dr. Martin Luther King and roughly 25,000 civil rights activists successfully completed their 4-day, 50-mile march from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery, Alabama. Standing on the steps of the Capitol, King delivered his famous "How long, not long" speech. This march was the turning point that led directly to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now we move on to March 26th. On March 26th, 1979, in a historic ceremony at the White House, Egyptian President Anwar al-Sadat and Israel Prime Minister Menachem Begin signed a peace treaty witnessed by U.S. President Jimmy Carter. This was the first peace treaty ever signed between Israel and an Arab neighbor, ending 30 years of war and leading to both Sadat and Begin receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. Now we move on to March 27th. On March 27, 1958, at the height of the Cold War, Nikita Khrushchev consolidated his power by becoming the premier of the Soviet Union while remaining the first secretary of the Communist Party. This move made him the undisputed leader of the USSR, overseeing pivotal moments like the space race and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now we move on to March 28th. On March 28, 1979, the worst commercial nuclear disaster in U.S. history took place at the 3 Mile Island power plant near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. A series of mechanical failures and human errors led to the partial shutdown of the Unit 2 reactor core. While it released only a small amount of radiation, the event fundamentally changed public perception of nuclear energy and led to much stricter federal safety regulations. Now we move on to March 29th. On March 29th, 1973, 2 months after the signing of the Paris Peace Accords, the United States combat troops departed from South Vietnam. While some military advisors and Marines guarding U.S. installations remained, this marked the end of direct U.S. involvement in the war that had lasted over a decade. Now we move on to March 30th. On March 30th, 1981, just 69 days into his presidency, Ronald Reagan was shot and seriously wounded by John Hinckley Jr. outside of the Washington Hilton Hotel. The bullet narrowly missed Reagan's heart. White House Press Secretary James Brady was also shot and left permanently disabled. The event that eventually led to the Brady Bill for gun control. Reagan's humorous and calm demeanor during the crisis significantly boosted his public approval rating. We now move on to March 31st. On March 31st, 1991, in a major milestone marking the end of the Cold War, the military alliance of the Warsaw Pact was formally dissolved. This signaled the collapse of the Soviet military dominance in Eastern Europe and paved the way for many former members of the nations to eventually join NATO. We now move on to April 1st. On April 1st, 1976, Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and Ronald Wayne founded Apple Computer Incorporated in a garage in Los Altos, California. The company would go on to revolutionize personal computing, music, and mobile technology, eventually becoming one of the most valuable corporations in the world. Now we move on to April 2nd. On April 2nd, 1982, in a major geopolitical escalation, Argentine special forces invaded the British-held Falkland Islands. Claiming sovereignty over the territory, this launched the Falkland Wars, a 10-week undeclared conflict. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher responded by sending a naval task force to retake the islands, which they successfully did by June of that year. Now we move on to March 3rd. On April 3rd, 1986, the night before his assassination, Dr. Martin Luther King delivered his final speech at the Mason Temple in Memphis, Tennessee. Supporting striking sanitation workers, he spoke on his own morality in words that would become tragically prophetic. I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as the people, will get to the promised land. Now I move on to April 4th. On April 4th, 1968, in one of the most devastating moments in American history, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot and killed while standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. He was 39 years old. His death sparked a wave of riots and civil unrest across more than 100 U.S. cities and led to the rapid passage of the Fair Housing Act just days later. Now we move, and finally, April 5th. On April 5th, 1792, U.S. President George Washington exercised his veto power for the first time in American history. He rejected a bill concerning the apportionment of representatives among the states, deeming it unconstitutional. This established practical use of the executive check on legislative power. That's all I got for this week. Next week, well, not next week. In a few weeks, I will bring you more historical facts for 2 weeks again. But until then, see you guys next time, and God bless America.